So take out your notes packet on quadratic formula, go to number 1, and you're going to be taking notes during this video in your notes packet. It says to solve each of the following equations using the quadratic formula. So what I did was I wrote the quadratic formula up on the right-hand side. Also, the directions do say to write your answers in simplest radical form. So here we go. Before we even start, if we look at number 1, we need to get it in standard form. So we need it to be set equal to 0. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this 6x over here, and that's going to make that x squared minus 6x plus 2 equals 0. So now I'm in standard form with the highest power first, and then down to the constant last, and then set equal to 0. So remember that a is always the number that's in front of your x squared term. So the number that's in front of your x squared term is a 1. Then your b is going to be the number that's in front of your x term, and the number in front of your x term is negative 6. And then your c is going to be the constant term, the number that's by itself, which is a positive 2. So then what we do is we simply start by plugging in those numbers into the quadratic formula. So it says x equals negative b. Well, if we look, our b is negative 6. So if we negate a negative 6, we'll end up with a positive 6. Then we write plus or minus. Then we put a big square root symbol. And then we're going to do b squared. So negative 6, that quantity squared, minus 4 times our a value, which is 1, times our c value, which is 2. And then that whole quantity is going to be over 2 times a. Well, our a value is 1. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to do a little bit of simplifying. So we have 6 plus or minus. All right, so underneath the square root, we have negative 6 squared. And if we square that negative 6, we get 36. Minus, and then 4 times 1 times 2 is 8. And this entire thing is over 2. So then we have x equals 6 plus or minus the square root of, and then we do 36 minus 8, which is, 28, right? And that whole thing is over 2. Okay, now, what the directions tell us to do is to put this in simplest radical form. So I'm just going to bring it up over here, and we are going to break down that radical. So I have x equals 6 plus or minus, and then I know that the square root of 28 I can break into 4 times 7. And the reason why I chose 4 times 7 is because 4 is a perfect square, so I can take the square root of 4. So then I have, come on now, x equals 6 plus or minus the square root of 4, which is a 2, and 7 is not a perfect square, so I leave it underneath the square root and put this all over 2. Okay, now what I want you to notice, though, is that this 6, the 2, and the 2 have a common factor. So I can take these numbers and I can divide out a common factor of 2, which is what I'm going to do. So I have x equals 3 plus or minus. Now that's 1 radical 7. I don't need to write the 1, so I'm just going to write radical 7. And then the whole thing technically is over 1, but I don't need to write that either. So just kind of going back, if I'm dividing the previous step, everything by 2, this would become a 3, this will become a 1, and this will become a 1. But those 1s are not necessary to write. So in simplest radical form, this is our answer to the first question. All right, let's look at number 2. Again, you should be taking notes in your notes packet. Well, with this one, everything is in standard form. We have the highest power first. Everything is all on one side of the equal sign and set equal to 0. So we're going to just get moving. So here, we're just going to say that a is the number, remember, in front of the x squared term. B is the number that is next in front of the x term, which would be negative 4. And c is the number that's the constant by itself, which is negative 3. So x equals The formula says negative b, which means to negate b. Well, since our b is a negative 4, if we negate that, we end up with a positive 4. Plus or minus, then we do the big square root, and then it's b squared, so that's going to be negative 4, that quantity squared, minus 4 times a, which is 2, and c, which is negative 3. Alrighty, and then this whole thing is over 2 times a, which is 2. Alright, so let's do a little bit of simplifying here. We have 4 plus or minus. Now, negative 4, if I square that, is a positive 16. Now, if we look down here, I have two negatives. I have minus 4 times 2 times negative 3. So those two negatives are going to make a positive, and then 4 times 2 times 3 will give us 24. Okay, and that whole thing is over 4. Let's go one extra step and simplify what's inside that square root, and we are going to get 40. And that whole thing is over 4. All right, so now what we're going to do is the directions say to put it in simplest radical form, so we're going to break down that 40. So let's go back up over here again, and we get x equals 4 plus or minus, and I know 40 is 4 times 10, and the reason why I'm choosing that, again, 4 is a perfect square. So, now let's put that all over 4. So then I have x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 4, which is 2, radical 10, and that whole thing is over 4. All right, so let's look at this one. Now I notice that these three terms here, come on, there we go, they all have a common factor of 2, so I'm going to divide by 2. So this will be a 2, this will become a 1, and this will become a 2. Okay, so then just to make it look nice and pretty, we're going to have 2 plus or minus. Now, I don't need to write the 1 in front of the radical 10. You're more than welcome to, but it's not necessary. And then this whole thing is over 2. So in simplest radical form, that's our answer. Let's look at number 5. Number 5 asks you to round to the nearest hundredth. So we're going to write x equals negative b. Now since b is negative 5, if we negate that, we will get a positive 5, plus or minus the square root of b squared. Negative 5, if I square that, is a positive 25, minus 4, times a, which is 1, times c, which is negative 3. Okay, and that whole thing is over 2 times a. Since a is 1, 2 times 1 is just 2. So if we keep going, we get x equals 5, plus or minus. Now underneath the square root, I really have 25 plus 12 because I have a negative 4 times a negative 3. So 25 plus 12 will give me 37. And that whole thing is over 2. Now here, 37 is prime, so we can't break that down anyway, but it does say to go to the nearest hundredth. So I'm going to go to my calculator, and all I need for you to do is just plug in the square root of 37 into your calculator. Now, just a reminder, you should be putting this into your packet. Okay, so when you take the square root of 37, you're going to get 6.0827. I like to go out 4 places. And then that whole thing will be divided by 2. All right, now at this point, what you want to do is you want to split up your answer into 2. So one of them will be x equals 5 plus 6.0827. Sorry, that's a little squishy and ugly. Divided by 2. And then the other one, oops, come on. There we go, will be x equals 5 minus 6.0827. And that whole thing divided by 2. All right, so then what you're going to do is you're going to take your calculator and you're going to plug that into your calculator. And on the top, we should get 5 0.5413. And on the bottom here, when we plug that into our calculator, we should get negative 0.54. My stylus does not want to work. 13. All right, now if you read the directions again, the directions tell you that we should go to the nearest hundredth. So this top one will be 5.54. There's a final answer to the nearest hundredth. And then the one on the bottom will be negative 0.54. All right, so now let's look at the last question. So the last question just says to solve using the quadratic formula. This is number 6A. Again, you should be taking notes in your packet. So we're going to start again. So we're going to say x equals negative b, which is negative 4, plus or minus the square root of b squared. Since b is 4, b squared will be 16, minus 4 times your a value, which is 4, times your c value, which is negative 3. Okay, let me extend that square root over. And then the whole thing is over 2 times a. Since a is 4, 2 times 4 is 8. All right, so let's keep going. So I have negative 4 plus or minus. Now I have 16. Now I've got a negative times a negative. I've got that negative 4 in front there and that negative 3 at the end. And a negative times a negative is a positive. And then 4 times 4 is 16. And then 16 times 3 is 48. All right, now just off to the side, I just kind of tend to do that all at once. So I do 16 plus 48, and that gives me 64. Now what you should note here is that the square root of 64 is a perfect square, and that's going to be 8. So let's just bring down that 8 denominator here. So what I really have then is negative 4 plus or minus that entire square root, which remember is 8, and that whole thing is over 8. All right, so now let's split up our answers here. Okay, so we're going to get x equals negative 4 plus 8 over 8. And then over here, I'm going to get x equals negative 4 minus 8 over 8. Okay. So if we look on the left here, negative 4 plus 8 is 4, and then 4 over 8 is just 1/2. So there's one answer. All right, over here on the right, I have negative 4 minus 8, and negative 4 minus 8 is a negative 12 over 8. And then if I reduce that, because both of those numbers are divisible by 4, so that would be negative 3/2. And there are your two answers.